Grand Assembly Hall of the Galactic Concord was the biggest room in the known galaxy. That was not a metaphor. It was literally the biggest room anyone had ever built. The ceiling was so high that small clouds sometimes formed near the top. The floor was made of a pale stone that had been brought from 47 different home worlds, one slab from each member species, pressed together into a single mosaic that spread across an area larger than most cities. Every seat in the hall could hold a delegate from a different civilization. Most of those seats were filled today. It was not a normal session. Ambassador Vilcos of the Jaketh Empire walked to the center platform with the slow, deliberate steps of someone who already knew how the day was going to end. He was tall, even by Jaketh standards. His skin was a deep blue-gray, shorty the color of a sky just before a heavy storm. His uniform was black with gold along the collar and sleeves, the kind of uniform that was designed not for comfort, but for impression. He wore it well. He had been wearing uniforms like it his entire life. The hall went quiet as he reached the speaking podium. Not the polite quiet of an audience waiting for something interesting, the tight, nervous quiet of an audience that already knew what was coming and was hoping they were wrong. Vilcos looked out at the assembled delegates. His yellow eyes moved slowly across the room. He was in no hurry. He let the silence stretch just a little longer than was comfortable. Then he spoke. His voice came out of the translation systems clean and flat and cold. The Jaketh Empire addresses the Galactic Concord on a matter of territorial necessity. Territorial necessity, that was the phrase. Two words that, in the long history of galactic politics, had almost always meant the same thing. Someone was about to lose something. Koss continued. He laid it out simply. The Kepler Corridor, a stretch of space that connected the inner Concord systems to the resource-rich outer belt, had been under human administration for 60 years. The Empire had determined that this corridor was, in their words, strategically mismanaged. Trade flow was inefficient. Security protocols were inadequate. The corridor's full potential was being wasted under human stewardship. The Empire was prepared to correct this. Humanity had 30 standard days to begin the formal transfer of administrative control over the Kepler Corridor to Jaketh Imperial Authority. All human vessels, stations, and personnel currently operating within the corridor would be given safe passage out. There would be no violence, provided the transfer was orderly and on schedule. And if it was not orderly and on schedule? Koss paused again. He seemed to enjoy the pauses. The Empire's Third Armada is currently positioned at the edge of the Concord neutral zone, he said. It consists of 4,200 warships. They will enforce compliance if compliance is not freely given. He stepped back from the podium. He folded his hands behind his back. He waited. The hall exploded. Not literally, but the noise that came out of 400 alien delegates all reacting at the same time was something close to it. Voices in dozens of languages poured through the translation systems and came out as a wall of sound. Some delegates were standing. Some were already moving toward communication terminals to send urgent messages back to their home governments. The Torathi delegation, small insect-like beings who communicated mostly through the vibration of their wing casings, filled their section of the hall with a low, resonant hum that everyone nearby found deeply unpleasant. The Concord Council chair, an elderly American named Dos Vell, struck his ceremonial staff against the podium 3 times. The sound rang out like a bell. Slowly, the noise dropped back to something manageable. Dos Vell looked exhausted. He had been running Concord sessions for 30 years. He had handled border disputes, trade wars, 2 near genocides, and the infamous Pelori incident, which had almost broken the Concord apart entirely. He had seen a great deal of political ugliness in his long career. But there was something about today that felt different, heavier, like the beginning of something that would not end cleanly. He looked to the human delegation box. Human Ambassador Elena Vasquez was already standing. She was not tall. She was not physically imposing in any way that an alien observer would immediately notice. She was a human woman in her mid-50s, with dark hair going gray at the temples, and a face that had the particular kind of calmness that comes not from ease but from long practice. She wore the standard diplomatic uniform of the Terran Concord mission, deep blue with a small silver emblem of Earth on the lapel. No decorations, no rank insignia, just the emblem. She walked to the speaking podium at the same steady pace she always walked everywhere. She set her notes down. She did not look at them. "The Terran Concord mission thanks Ambassador Koss for his directness," she said. Her voice was even. Not warm, not cold, even. "Humanity formally requests the full 30 days allotted under Article 14 of the Concord Charter before any response is required. We will use that time to review the Empire's position carefully and respond through proper channels." She paused. "We ask that the Third Armada remain outside the neutral zone during this period, counted as required by the same charter." Then she picked up her notes and walked back to her seat. That was it. That was the whole response. The hall went quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet this time. Confused quiet. People had expected argument, protest, emotional appeals to Concord law. Humans were known, among other species, for arguing loudly and at length about things they felt strongly about. Elena Vasquez had just been told that 4,000 ships were pointed at her species, and she had responded with a procedural request and sat down. Several delegates exchanged glances. After the session broke, the hallways outside the assembly filled with the low, rapid conversations of people who had a great deal to say now that the cameras were off. Small clusters of delegates formed and broke apart and reformed. Our information moved fast in the Concord. Within an hour of the session ending, every major government in known space had a full report of what had happened. Most of those reports contained some version of the same assessment. Humanity was in serious trouble. A Tarathi senior delegate named Res Ka found Vasquez in one of the smaller side corridors, away from the main crowd. Res Ka was old and cautious and had, over the course of a long career, developed a genuine respect for the human people. She pulled Vasquez aside with the particular urgency of someone delivering news they wished they did not have to deliver. "Elena," she said, dropping formality entirely, "I have to be direct with you. I've spoken with 3 other delegations in the last hour. There's quiet discussion about whether the Concord, as a body, it can actually do anything to stop this. The Charter has provisions, but the Empire hasn't technically violated any of them yet. And when the 30 days are up—" "I know," Vasquez said. "They have 4,000 ships." "I know that too." Reska's wing casings made a low, soft sound. In Tarathi, it was close to the sound of grief. "Is there anything your government can realistically do? Militarily?" Elena Vasquez looked at her. There was something in her expression that Reska could not quite read. It was not fear. It was not despair. It was not even the flat blankness of someone who had already accepted defeat and was simply going through the motions. It was, if Reska had to name it, something closer to patience. "We're going to review the situation," Vasquez said carefully. "Shonak and respond in the appropriate time." Reska clicked her mandibles, the Torathi equivalent of a very tired sigh, and let her go. Over the next 3 days, 2 more delegations quietly approached Vasquez with similar conversations. The Pelori suggested humanity might want to consider a negotiated partial transfer. Give up the outer sections of the corridor, retain administrative control of the inner relay stations. It was not a good deal, but it was a deal that did not involve 4,000 warships. The Harkin Collective, an older and generally more cautious civilization, went even further and suggested that territorial concessions were not the end of the world. Species survived them. Humanity was young. There would be other corridors. Vasquez listened to all of it politely. She thanked everyone for their concern. She said that humanity would respond through proper channels at the appropriate time. Nobody found this comforting. Nobody was meant to. 312 light-years away from the Grand Assembly Hall, in a region of space that official Concord navigation charts labeled as the Kepler Administrative Buffer Zone, there was a moon. The moon orbited a medium-sized gas giant called Harkin 7 on most charts, though humans who worked in the region had long ago started calling it Old Blue on account of its color. The moon itself had no official name. It appeared on survey maps as KAB-7M3. It was not particularly notable. It had no atmosphere worth mentioning, no valuable mineral deposits, no strategic significance that any outside observer had ever identified. It had been surveyed twice in the last 60 years, and both surveys had noted nothing of interest. The surveys had been wrong. Deep inside KAB-7M3, Carved into the rock of the moon itself, over the course of 4 decades of quiet, unrecorded work, there was a structure. It was not small. It was not simple. It was a dry dock facility of enormous size, large enough to service ships that no official human registry had ever listed. The walls were lined with equipment. The floors were tracked with the kind of heavy machinery you only needed when you were moving things that were very, very large. The facility had been dark for 11 years. Not abandoned, maintained, in the careful, minimal way that things are maintained when you are waiting for a specific moment to use them. A small crew, no unnecessary signals, no transmissions that could be intercepted. Just quiet waiting in the dark, far from any route that outsiders would have reason to travel. On the third day after the grand assembly session, a signal arrived. It was short, encrypted at a level that most Concord member species would have needed several years to break. It came from a relay node that, officially, did not exist. The signal contained exactly 4 words: Prometheus Protocol. Stand up. The crew chief at KAB-7M3 was a heavy-set man named Sergeant Torres, who had been running maintenance rotations at the facility for 9 years. He had been waiting for this signal for a long time, long enough that some part of him had occasionally wondered if it would ever actually come. He read it once. He read it again. Then he stood up from his chair, walked to the main control panel, and began entering the activation sequence. Around him, the lights in the facility came on for the first time in over a decade. Not the dim maintenance lights he had been living under. The real lights. All of them. The scale of the place became visible. Torres had been inside it for 9 years, and even he, standing at the control panel, watching the full facility come to life for the first time, felt something move through him that was difficult to describe. Something between pride and awe, and a distant, quiet warning that human beings sometimes felt when they were in the presence of something that had been built with a very serious purpose. The ships inside the facility were not the kind of ships that appeared on Concord registry lists. They were not the trim, elegant shapes that most spacefaring civilizations had settled on after centuries of design refinement. They were angular, heavy, built in a way that suggested the engineers who designed them had looked at conventional wisdom about ship construction and decided that conventional wisdom was not the point. One by one, across dozens of systems, in moons and asteroid belts, and deep space stations that no outside survey had ever marked as significant, the same scene was playing out. The same signal arriving, the same lights coming on, the same machinery starting up, the same ships waking up in the dark. The Galactic Empire had 30 days. Those 30 days were going to be very busy. Back at the Concord Assembly, the formal diplomatic schedule continued. There were procedural sessions about the Kepler situation. Legal scholars from 4 different species gave presentations on the relevant sections of the Concord Charter. The Empire's delegation attended these sessions with the polite disinterest of people who had already decided the outcome and were simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up. Vile Koss held a press gathering on day 5. He was measured and professional. He expressed the Empire's deep respect for the Concord process and its sincere hope that the situation would be resolved peacefully. He used the word peacefully 3 times in 10 minutes, which every political journalist in attendance noted was exactly the same number of times it had been used before each of the Empire's last 4 territorial acquisitions. On day 7, the American Diplomatic Council formally requested that humanity consider mediated negotiation. Na Vasquez accepted the request with grace and warmth and then gently declined to commit to a specific timeline. On day 12, a Harkin analyst published a widely read report estimating that the human defensive fleet, based on all available data, could field approximately 600 combat-capable vessels, aging, lightly armed, and almost certainly not capable of sustaining engagement against the Third Armada for more than a few hours. The report was picked up by nearly every major galactic news network. Most political commentators agreed with its conclusions. Some added their own analysis. The general tone was that while humanity's situation was unfortunate, it was not, in the grand calculus of galactic history, particularly surprising. Younger civilizations without large fleets had faced this kind of pressure before. Some had survived it, some had not. The human delegation issued no official response to the report. Vasquez was seen on day 15 having lunch in one of the assembly's smaller dining areas with two junior staff members. She was, by multiple accounts from people who were there, laughing at something one of them had said. She looked, according to one Tarathi junior diplomat, who later described the scene to a colleague, like someone who was not worried, which, the Tarathi junior diplomat added, was either very brave or very strange, because the numbers simply did not add up. He was right that the numbers did not add up. He was wrong about why. On day 29, Ambassador Elena Vasquez sent a formal communication to Valcos. It was brief. It acknowledged that the 30-day window would expire the following morning. It stated that humanity had reviewed its position. It stated that humanity would not be transferring control of the Kepler corridor. It contained no threats, no requests, no further explanation. Koss read it at his desk in the Imperial Diplomatic Suite. He set it down. He sent a single short message to the Third Armada's command channel. The message instructed them to proceed to the Kepler corridor at first light. Then he poured himself a drink because he felt that was appropriate for the occasion. Humanity was, in his estimation, a minor civilization making a foolish choice. But foolish choices by minor civilizations were still, technically, choices. And there was something mildly sad about the end of a thing, even a small thing. He drank. He did not think about the fact that Elena Vasquez had not seemed afraid. He had met many diplomats from many species in his long career, and he had learned to recognize the face of a bluff. He did not consider, not even for a moment, that she might not have been bluffing at all. Far away in the dark, the ships were ready. The 30 days were up. Tomorrow, everything would change. Commander Shrath Vaughn of the Jaqueth Imperial Intelligence Division had a reputation for being thorough. This was, among intelligence officers, considered the highest possible compliment. It meant that he did not cut corners. It meant that when he submitted a report, it was correct. It meant that when he signed his name at the bottom of an assessment, emperors and fleet admirals could take it to their strategy tables and build plans around it without worrying that something important had been missed. He had built that reputation over 27 years of careful, methodical work. He had assessed 6 civilizations before this one. All 6 assessments had been accurate. The resulting military operations had all gone according to plan. 3 civilizations had surrendered before the first shot was fired, having looked at the same numbers Shrathvon had put together and reached the same conclusion that their own defense was hopeless. The other 3 had tried to fight anyway and discovered quickly that he had been right. He had no reason to believe this assessment would be any different. He sat at his desk in the Intelligence Division's Analysis Center and looked at the finished report that his team had put together over the last year. It was comprehensive, it was detailed. It covered every aspect of human military capability that his network had been able to observe, verify, and cross-reference. Hull designs, engine outputs, weapon classifications, fleet registry numbers, crew sizes, supply chains, repair infrastructure, the locations of known orbital stations, and the personnel rosters of the ships that use them. 612 active warships. That was the number. Give or take a few that might be in dry dock or undergoing upgrades at any given time. Light to medium class mostly. A handful of heavier vessels that could technically be classified as warships in the serious sense. Ships with real weapons, real armor, real shields. Those numbered fewer than 80. Against 4,200 Jaqueth warships of the Third Armada, the largest, our most modern fleet the Empire had deployed in 2 generations. Those numbers were not a fight. They were not even a delay. They were a gesture. Shrathvon signed the report. He forwarded it to the Imperial Strategy Council. He accepted their commendations on the quality of the work. He felt satisfied, in the particular quiet way that thorough people feel satisfied when a job has been done correctly. He did not yet know that he had made the most catastrophic error of his career. He had not missed anything on purpose. That was important to understand. He was not lazy or careless or corrupt. He had looked exactly where he was supposed to look. He had examined exactly what the data led him to examine. He had applied every analytical tool available to him and reached conclusions that were perfectly supported by the evidence he had. The problem was not what he had found. The problem was what he had never been allowed to see. 63 years before Shrathvon signed his report, Something happened that almost nobody outside of humanity's own records talked about anymore. It was not a famous event in galactic history. It barely appeared in Concord archives. It did not have a name that other species knew or used. Humans called it the Vashti Incident. In those early decades of humanity's membership in the Galactic Concord, when human settlements were still spreading across new star systems and the infrastructure connecting them was still young and thin, a group of ships appeared above 3 human colony worlds. They did not belong to any species that humanity had encountered before. Later investigations suggested they were the remnants of a collapsed civilization from beyond the Concord's outer boundaries. Not organized enough to be called a military, not random enough to be called pirates. Something in between, something old and angry and far from home. They did not send messages. They did not make demands. They attacked. The 3 colonies had minimal defenses. The Concord's response was slow, not because anyone intended it to be, but because the bureaucratic and logistical machinery of a 47-species government simply moved at the speed it moved, and that speed was not fast enough. By the time Concord peacekeeping forces arrived, 2 of the colonies had been largely destroyed. The third survived only because a single human patrol vessel, the UES Forward, had put itself directly between the attacking ships and the colony's evacuation transports and refused to move until every transport was clear. The Forward did not survive the engagement. Roughly 60,000 people died in the Vashti incident. By galactic standards, it was a small number. The galaxy was old and violent, and 60,000 deaths over 3 days barely registered on the long scale of known history. The Concord issued formal condolences. A committee was formed to review response protocols. Several reports were written. Humanity received all of this with outward gratitude and inward silence. And then, very quietly, very carefully, with a patience and deliberateness that would later be recognized as one of the most remarkable things any species had ever done, humanity decided that it would never be caught helpless again. When the decision was not made in a single meeting or announced in a public speech, it did not come from one government or one leader. It came from a collective understanding that spread through human civilization over the years following Vashti like water moving through rock, slowly, invisibly, completely. Every human government, every military body, every relevant agency arrived at the same conclusion through their own reasoning and their own grief. The galaxy was not safe. The Concord was not enough. Help, when it came too late. The only real protection was the kind you built yourself. But here was the problem. Humanity was already under observation. The Concord required member species to register military assets. Trade partners monitored ship movements. Intelligence services from a dozen civilizations tracked human industrial output as a matter of routine. Any large visible expansion of human military capability would be noticed, analyzed, discussed, and, most dangerously, feared. A frightened galactic community might decide that a rapidly militarizing humanity was itself a threat. The cure could become worse than the disease. So humanity did something else entirely. The public military budget was maintained at its existing levels. Registered ships continued to be registered. The numbers that outside observers watched stayed exactly where they were expected to stay. Human politicians gave speeches about peace and diplomacy and the importance of working within conquered frameworks. The registered fleet of 600 ships was real, maintained, and crewed. It went on patrols. It participated in joint conquered exercises. It showed up on every monitoring report from every intelligence service watching human space. It was essentially a very expensive, very elaborate, very well-maintained distraction, because underneath it, hidden in the rock of uninhabited moons, buried in the cores of unremarkable asteroid belts, operating out of stations that existed on no official chart, something else was being built. Something that had no name in any public document. Something funded through budget lines so deeply buried in civilian infrastructure programs that even most human politicians never saw them clearly. The engineers who worked on it called it Prometheus. The name came from an old human story. A figure who had stolen fire from the gods and given it to humanity so that they would never be cold and helpless again. The people who had named the program had chosen it deliberately. They understood what they were building and why. The ships they built were unlike anything else in known space. This was partly a matter of necessity. If the ships looked like standard galactic warship designs, they might be identified from partial scans or sensor sweeps by intelligence services that were looking in the wrong direction. So the engineers designed them differently, radically differently. They looked at the design philosophies of every other spacefaring civilization and then, deliberately, went in another direction. Other species built their warships with elegance, smooth hulls, clean lines, designs that had been refined over centuries toward an aesthetic of sleek, lethal efficiency. They built their weapons to do exactly what was needed and nothing more. They calculated stress tolerances precisely and built to those tolerances. They designed life support systems to support the number of crew they planned to carry, and engines powerful enough to move the ships they had designed, and shields strong enough to handle the weapons they expected to face. Human engineers had a different philosophy. It could be summarized in a single word: more. More armor than any calculation said was strictly necessary. More engine power than the hull design required. More weapons than the strategic doctrine called for. More redundant systems. More backup power. More structural reinforcement. More of everything in ways that other species engineers would have looked at and described as wasteful, excessive, and irrational. They were not wrong. By any conventional measure, the Prometheus ships were absurdly overbuilt. The materials cost alone, if it had ever been properly calculated and made public, would have looked like a civilizational budget error. The ships were heavier than they needed to be. Their engines were more powerful than their weight required. Their weapons could put out energy at levels that the targeting computers struggled to fully utilize. But over decades, iteration by iteration, a strange thing happened. The engineers kept learning. They kept finding ways to make the overbuilt systems work together in ways they hadn't been designed to. The excessive engine power meant the heavy ships could accelerate at rates that seemed physically wrong. The overbuilt armor, combined with the redundant shield systems, meant that damage that would have crippled a conventional warship barely slowed a Prometheus vessel down. The overarmed weapon systems, refined over years of testing in deep space where nobody was watching, turned out to be capable of output levels that no combat assessment from any other species would have predicted. Nobody saw this. Nobody was supposed to, and the ships kept being built, year after year, in the dark, in the quiet, in the places that surveys never found, because the surveys were never looking. The program grew. It was expensive in ways that defied description, but humanity had decided, collectively and quietly, that it did not matter. Some things were more important than the cost. The people who worked on Prometheus did not talk about it. Not to family, not to friends, not to anyone who did not have specific clearance. They lived in facilities that did not officially exist, working on ships that were not officially real, serving a program that had no official name in any document a non-human might ever read. They were well paid and well cared for, and they knew, all of them, exactly what they were doing and why. They were making sure Vashti never happened again. Shrathvan received the anomaly report on day 22 of the 30-day window. It came from a long-range probe that had been positioned at the outer edge of human space as part of standard pre-operation surveillance. The probe had been there for months, quietly recording traffic patterns, ship movements, and energy signatures. Its reports had been regular and unremarkable, which was exactly what Shrathvan had expected. This report was not unremarkable. The probe had detected something near an uninhabited moon in the Kepler administrative buffer. A brief energy signature, strong, stronger than anything a routine maintenance operation or a minor survey vessel would produce. It had lasted 11 seconds and then stopped. The probe had attempted to get a visual. What it had captured in the last fragment of transmission before the feed cut to static was a silhouette in the dark. It was large, very large. The geometry was wrong in a way that was difficult to articulate. Not the smooth curves and deliberate angles of standard warship design, but something heavier, harder, more aggressively constructed. Like it had been built not to look impressive, but to survive. The image was fragmentary, partial. The probe had gone offline immediately after transmitting it. Equipment failure. Most likely, though the probe maintenance logs had shown no prior issues. Strathvan looked at the image for a long time. He ran it through the standard recognition database. It did not match any known human vessel class. He sent it to his analysis team. They came back with the same result, no match found, most likely a sensor artifact or a reflection off the moon's surface creating a false silhouette. He filed the report in the anomaly archive. He noted it as unverified and inconclusive. He did not change his overall assessment. He thought about it briefly the next morning while reading through the overnight reports. He thought about the image, that heavy, wrong shape in the dark. He thought about the energy signature, stronger than it should have been. He thought about the 11 seconds and then nothing. And then he set the thought aside. The report was one data point. His assessment was built on hundreds of data points, carefully gathered and cross-referenced over months of work. One fuzzy image from a probe that had subsequently failed was not sufficient reason to revise a conclusion that the entire analytical framework supported. He was, after all, thorough. He had no way of knowing that the probe hadn't failed. It had been found and quietly removed by a maintenance crew working out of a facility that did not officially exist. The image it had captured, fragmented and unclear as it was, had shown the bow section of a ship called UES Titan, one of 31 vessels of its class currently going through final pre-deployment checks inside the KAB-7M3 facility alone. There were other facilities, many others. And the energy signature the probe had detected was not from a maintenance operation. It was from the Titan's main drive systems coming online for the first time in 11 years. 11 seconds had been more than enough time to wake something like that up. Strathvan went back to his other work. The operation was scheduled to proceed on day 30. His report was signed, submitted, and accepted. The Third Armada was ready. Everything was in order. He was, as always, thorough. He had simply been thorough in all the wrong places. On the eve of day 29, in a command room deep inside a human installation that appeared on no chart, Admiral James Morrow looked at the display in front of him. The display showed positions, hundreds of them, color-coded, ranked by class and combat readiness status, green for fully operational, yellow for operational with minor issues, red for not yet ready. There was very little red on the display. Morrow was 61 years old. He had spent his entire adult life in the Prometheus program, starting as a junior engineer on hull stress analysis and working his way up through every level of the organization over 3.5 decades. He knew these ships the way other people knew their own homes. He had watched them being built. He had been present at the first test firings of the main weapons. He had, on 3 separate occasions, stood inside the engine rooms of the largest vessels and felt the vibration of their drives run through the soles of his boots and up through his entire body. He loved these ships. He would have been embarrassed to say that out loud, but it was true. He looked at the display for a while. Then he looked at his communications officer. "Patch me through to the fleet," he said. The officer nodded. The connection opened. Morrow looked at the display one more time. He thought about Vashti. He thought about the UES Forward and the crew that had stayed between the enemy and the evacuation ships until there was nothing left of them. He thought about 60,000 people who had never known what was being built in their name, in the dark, in the quiet, for all the years since. "This is Admiral Morrow," he said. "It's time." Outside, across a dozen systems, in moons and asteroid belts and deep space stations, 3,000 years of human stubbornness and grief and determination finished waking up. The fleet was ready. Tomorrow the Empire was going to learn what they had missed. The Jacques Third Armada came out of faster-than-light travel in perfect formation. This was not an accident. Formation discipline on FTL exit was considered one of the clearest indicators of a military force's overall quality. Sloppy fleets scattered across wide areas when they dropped back into normal space. Elite fleets held their shape. The Third Armada held its shape with a kind of precise, confident unity that only came from years of training and a great deal of experience doing this exact thing to people who were not happy to see them. 4,200 warships, arranged in 7 battle groups, each one a layered formation of heavy capital ships in the center, cruiser screens around them, and fast attack vessels on the outer edges. It was a formation designed to project force in every direction simultaneously. It was a formation designed to communicate in the clearest possible visual language that resistance was not a rational option. The commander of the Third Armada was Fleet Admiral Varketh, a veteran of 11 engagements and a figure so well regarded in Imperial military circles that his face appeared on the cover of the most widely used tactical doctrine manual in the Jaketh officer training curriculum. He was 62 years old. He had been doing this for 40 years. He had never lost a fleet action. He stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Imperial Will, and looked at the sensor display as his fleet finished its formation exit. He waited for the full picture to resolve. He wanted to see exactly what humanity had deployed in response to his arrival. The display showed 17 ships. Varketh looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at his sensor chief. "Confirm," he said. "Confirmed, Admiral," the sensor chief said. 17 vessels. Designations match human registry classes. Light to medium weight. No capital ships detected. Varketh looked at the display again. 17 ships against 4,200. He had fought against desperate defenders before. He had fought against enemies who knew they were going to lose and had chosen to fight anyway, for reasons of pride or principle, or simply because they had nowhere else to go. He respected that, in the particular detached way that a professional soldier respects a gesture, even when the gesture is futile. But this was something different. 17 ships was not a defense. 17 ships was a symbol, a single raised hand in front of an oncoming tide. And he opened a communication channel to the lead human vessel. The protocol required that he offer one final opportunity to comply before any engagement. He was a professional. He followed protocol. The face that appeared on his screen was a heavy-set human male with gray hair and the kind of broad, weathered face that spoke of a great many years spent in space. He was sitting in what appeared to be a command chair, but he was not sitting in the alert, forward-leaning posture of someone in a crisis situation. He was sitting in the relaxed, slightly sideways posture of someone who was comfortable. He was, Varketh noted with some confusion, holding what appeared to be a food item, something wrapped in a thin, flat bread. He was eating it. "I am Fleet Admiral Varketh of the Jaketh Third Armada," Varketh said. "You are addressed as the commanding officer of the human vessels in this corridor. I am offering you a final opportunity to withdraw from this space and acknowledge the transfer of administrative control to Imperial authority. Compliance will guarantee the safety of your vessels and personnel." He paused. He waited. The human looked at him. Then he took another bite of his food. He chewed. He swallowed. He seemed to be in no particular hurry. "Admiral," the human said, and his voice was the unhurried voice of someone having a very ordinary conversation. "My name is James Morrow. I'm the commanding officer of the United Earthship Rubicon, and—" he paused briefly, as if the next part was something he needed to say carefully to make sure it came out right. "Quite a bit more besides." Varketh kept his expression level. "I am asking you to stand down." "I heard you," Morrow said. He set down his food. He straightened slightly in his chair. Something in his posture changed. Not dramatically, just enough to notice. The relaxed quality was still there, but underneath it, something else had come to the surface. Something harder. "Admiral, those 17 ships behind me aren't humanity's fleet. They're the welcoming committee. I wanted to be clear about that before things got complicated. You are not in a position to—" "Prometheus," Morrow said, not to Varketh, to someone off-screen, to someone in his own command chain. His eyes moved briefly to the side and then back to the screen. Full reveal. Varketh saw the sensor display change before he understood what he was seeing. The first signals came from the asteroid belt to the Third Armada's port side. On hundreds of contacts, then thousands. Ships emerging from concealment positions in the rock, their signatures suddenly blazing on every sensor screen on every ship in the fleet. They were large, they were very large. Their geometries were unlike anything in the Imperial recognition database. Angular, heavy, constructed with an aggressive solidity that looked almost geological in its density. Then the signals started coming from the gas giant to starboard. More ships, rising out of the upper atmosphere in long columns, their drives burning bright on the sensor screens. Then from below the fleet's formation, from above it, from positions woven into the fabric of the corridor itself, In places where the sensor sweeps had passed 100 times and found nothing, because whatever was hiding there had been designed by people who understood exactly what sensors were looking for and how to avoid it. Everywhere. They were everywhere. The bridge of the Imperial will went very quiet. Varketh looked at his sensor display. He looked at the numbers that were appearing on it. He looked at his sensor chief, who was staring at his screens with the expression of someone who has been told something by their instruments and cannot make themselves believe it. Numbers, Varketh said. Sir, the sensor chief said, and stopped. He cleared his throat. He looked at his screen again. Sir, I'm reading over 7,000 contacts, and more still resolving. Confirmed contacts, Varketh said. Not ghosts. Not sensor artifacts. Confirmed, sir. The sensor chief's voice had gone very flat, the way voices went flat when the person speaking was fighting to remain professional against something that was trying to knock them over. Over 7,000 confirmed combat vessels, sizes ranging from heavy cruiser class to... He stopped again. To what? To classes we don't have designations for, sir. I've never seen anything this size. The recognition database isn't returning matches. Varketh looked at the display. He looked at it for a long time. Then he opened the channel to the Rubicon again. Morrow was still there, still sitting in his chair. His food was still on the armrest where he had set it down. Admiral Morrow, Varketh said, and he was proud of how even his voice came out. I would like to discuss. I know, Morrow said. He did not look triumphant. He did not look angry. He looked like a man who had been waiting for a very long time for a very specific moment, and had arrived at it and found it to be exactly what he had expected. But I'm afraid we're a little past the discussing stage. You came here to take something from us. We'd like you to understand, clearly and permanently, that that is not going to happen. So we're going to have a conversation the only way that makes an impression. Varketh opened his mouth. Fire, Morrow said. Not to him. The battle began. The first volleys came from the outer screen of human vessels that had emerged from the asteroid belt. They were not the opening shots of a fleet that was afraid or desperate. They were precise, coordinated, and targeted with a specificity that told Varketh's tactical officers something important immediately. The humans had done their reconnaissance. They knew the Third Armada's formation. They knew where the command ships were. They knew where the shield generators were positioned on the fleet's heavy cruisers. They had been watching and planning for this for a long time. The Jaketh shields held against the first wave. That was expected. Imperial shields were among the best in known space. Their cruisers were armored to survive sustained fire from any comparable class of vessel. Varketh's tactical officers confirmed shield integrity across the formation and began organizing the return fire. They were professionals. They were not going to panic. They were going to fight. The return fire landed on the human ships. The human ships moved. And this was the first thing that did not make sense. Ships of that size, and they were enormous, the heaviest human vessels that had decloaked were larger than anything in the Third Armada, were not supposed to move the way they moved. The physics of it were wrong. Heavy ships had heavy engines, and heavy engines pushed them at the speeds that their mass required. These ships were moving faster than their mass should have allowed. Much faster. They were not elegant about it. They did not glide or drift. They moved with a grinding, powerful aggression, like something very heavy that had been given an absurd amount of force and pointed in a direction. But they moved. The return fire hit shields and armor that absorbed it in ways that made Varketh's tactical officers look at their damage assessment screens with confusion. When the readouts told them the fire was landing, the ships told them something else. They were still there, still moving, still firing back. Shield penetration? Varketh asked. Minimal, sir, his tactical officer said, and the confusion in his voice was poorly hidden. Their shielding it's absorbing at a level we're not seeing degrade. Sir, we're hitting them with sustained fire, and I'm not reading significant shield loss on any of the capital-class vessels. Varketh looked at the display. He looked at the engagement data coming in from across the formation. He began to understand something that he did not want to understand. The Jaketh shields did not hold against the second wave. The human weapons systems hit with an energy output that the Imperial Tactical Database would later classify as physically anomalous. meaning that when the analysts tried to work backward from the damage data to calculate the weapons output required to cause it, the numbers they got did not match any weapon system in the database. Not because the weapons were magical or impossible, because they were running at power levels that conventional weapons engineering said you simply could not sustain without destroying the weapons themselves. The humans had apparently decided that conventional weapons engineering was a set of guidelines rather than rules. A Jaqueth heavy cruiser on the port flank took a direct hit from one of the larger human vessels and lost its shields entirely. A second hit opened a breach in its hull. A third hit reached the engine section. The cruiser went dark. On the starboard side, a group of smaller human ships, fast, maneuverable in a jerky, almost mechanical way that looked nothing like the smooth evasion patterns of trained warships but worked remarkably well regardless, had pushed through the outer screen of the fleet and were targeting the shield generators on the capital ships directly. The point defense systems of the Jaqueth ships opened up on them. Standard doctrine. Fast ships were fast ships. Dense point defense fire was designed to handle them. The human ships did not stop. They were taking hits. The point defense fire was landing, but the ships were constructed in a way that distributed damage across their mass instead of concentrating it. Systems that would have been critical failure points on standard warship designs were backed up, then backed up again, then backed up a third time. It was, from a pure engineering standpoint, enormously wasteful. Most of those backup systems would never be needed in a normal engagement. This was not a normal engagement, and the backup systems were needed. The human ships reached their targets. The shield generators on 3 Jaqueth capital ships went down. The heavy vessels in the human main line had been waiting for exactly that. They fired. 3 Jaqueth capital ships were critically damaged in the same 30-second window. Varketh watched it happen on his display and felt something he had not felt in 40 years of commanding fleet actions. He felt the shape of the engagement turning. He felt the momentum, that intangible, almost physical thing that experienced commanders could sense, shifting. His fleet was reacting. They were fighting back. They were doing everything they were trained to do. But the human ships were not behaving the way any of their intelligence assessments had suggested they would behave. And that gap between expectation and reality was creating hesitation in his line commanders. And hesitation in fleet combat was a very dangerous thing. He pushed the feeling aside. He was a professional. He had 4,000 ships. The numbers still favored him. He began reorganizing his formation, pulling the heaviest ships into a tighter core, concentrating fire on the human heavy vessels that were causing the most damage. It was good doctrine. It was what the training manuals said to do when a formation was under pressure from a more capable than expected enemy. The human fleet responded as if they had read his training manuals. The heavy vessels pulled back slightly, not retreating, but drawing his formation's concentrated fire while the faster human ships repositioned on the flanks. Then, just as his formation had committed to the new posture, the human heavy vessels stopped pulling back and came forward with everything they had. The collision of the two lines was not elegant. It was not the kind of battle that would be illustrated in future tactical manuals as a masterpiece of maneuver warfare. It was loud, brutal, and incredibly damaging to the Jaqueth formation. Ships at the point of contact were hit from multiple angles at the same time. Systems failed. Crews died. Ships broke apart, and their debris drifted into the engagement zone and caused problems for everyone still fighting. 2 hours after the engagement began, 31% of the Third Armada had been destroyed or critically disabled. Varketh looked at his display. He looked at the casualty figures coming in from across his formation. He looked at the human fleet. Still there, still pressing, still firing with that inexhaustible energy output that his tactical computers kept flagging as anomalous. He made a decision. It was the hardest decision he had ever made in 40 years of service. All fleet elements, he said. His voice was level. He had promised himself it would be level. Disengage. Pull back to rally point 7. Now. The bridge was very quiet. Sir, his tactical officer said carefully, Hajj, we still have nearly 3,000 combat capable. I know what we still have, my Varketh said, and I know what they still have. And I know what happens to the rest of our ships if we stay in this engagement. We pull back. The retreat order went out. The Jacques ships that could still move began to move. Some were slow, some were trailing debris and venting atmosphere. Some didn't make it to the rally point, but most of them moved in the particular ungraceful way of an elite force doing something it had never expected to have to do. On the bridge of the Rubicon, Admiral Morrow watched the retreat on his display. He watched until the last Jacques ship had cleared the engagement zone. Then he sat back in his chair and let out a long, slow breath. His communications officer looked at him. "Admiral, should we pursue?" Morrow was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "Let them go." "Sir, we didn't come out here to destroy them," Morrow said. "We came out here to teach them something. A lesson only works if the student survives to remember it." He picked up his food from the armrest where it had been sitting for 2 hours. He looked at it. It was cold. He ate it anyway. "Let them go home. Let them tell everyone what they saw." He looked at the display. The corridor was clear. The fleet was holding position, quiet and steady in the dark. "Get me a channel to Ambassador Vasquez," he said. "She's going to want to hear how the lesson went." The battle feed had gone out live. This was not accidental. The Concorde maintained a network of automated observation buoys throughout member space, and originally designed to monitor compliance with territorial agreements and trade treaties. They recorded everything and transmitted the recordings to the Concorde Central Archive in real time. The buoys near the Kepler corridor had been recording since the Third Armada arrived. Everything they captured went directly to the archive, and from the archive to the monitoring terminals of every member government's diplomatic mission. Every major civilization in the known galaxy watched the engagement as it happened. Some watched it quietly, with the focused attention of military analysts trying to understand what they were seeing. Some watched it loudly, with the chaotic energy of government officials and advisors all talking at once in crowded situation rooms. Some watched it on personal devices, in their quarters or offices, having been woken in the middle of their sleep cycles by the kind of alert that meant something significant was happening and they needed to be paying attention immediately. All of them watched all of it. The engagement lasted a little under 2 hours. In galactic terms, that was a short battle. Most major fleet actions in recorded history had lasted longer. But the length of the engagement was not what people were talking about in the hours and days that followed. What they were talking about was what happened during those 2 hours, what the human ships had done, what the human ships had been. The Concorde Communications Network recorded 11,400 separate transmissions between diplomatic missions in the 12 hours following the battle. This was more than 3 times the normal daily volume. Most of them were encrypted. Most of them were urgent. Most of them contained some version of the same question. "Did you see that?" The Grand Assembly was called into emergency session 36 hours after the engagement ended. The chamber was full in a way it rarely was, not just the usual delegations, but additional aides and advisors who had managed to find reasons to be present, filling the secondary observation galleries that normally sat mostly empty. There was a particular kind of energy in the room. Not panic exactly. Something more controlled than panic, but moving in the same direction. The energy of very intelligent, very experienced political minds confronting a situation that had fundamentally changed the landscape they operated in, and working hard to figure out what that meant. The Concorde Council Chair, Dos Vel, just struck his staff against the podium and called the session to order. He looked, if possible, even more tired than he had at the session 36 days ago when Val Koss had delivered the ultimatum. The kind of tired that was not about sleep. There were procedural motions. There were formal statements from several delegations. There was a long and somewhat circular discussion about the legal implications of the engagement under the Concorde Charter, during which at least 4 different delegations that had privately suggested humanity consider a negotiated surrender did not make eye contact with the human delegation. Elena Vasquez waited through all of it with the same patience she had shown throughout the entire 30 days. When Dosvel finally opened the floor to the human delegation, she stood and walked to the podium. The chamber was quieter this time, much quieter. The kind of quiet that was not polite attention, but genuine, wide-eyed focus. Every person in the room was watching her, not with pity, not with sympathy, with the particular sharp attention that people paid to someone they had fundamentally misjudged and were now trying to correctly assess. Vasquez set her notes on the podium. She looked out at the chamber. "The Terran Concord mission thanks the Council for convening this emergency session," she said. Her voice was the same as it always was, even measured, calm. "Humanity did not want this confrontation. We did not seek it. We responded to a direct threat to our territorial sovereignty with the minimum force required to make our position clear." She paused. "Our position is this. Humanity is a full member of this Concord, and with equal rights and equal standing. Our territorial sovereignty is not negotiable. The Kepler corridor is ours, and it will remain ours. These are not new positions. They have always been our positions. We have simply, for the first time, made them impossible to ignore." She reached into her folder and produced a physical document, actual printed paper, a very old human diplomatic tradition, used only for proposals of significant weight. "Humanity is tabling a formal proposal, the Concord Mutual Defense Compact. Under its terms, humanity will extend limited defensive technology cooperation to all full Concord member species in good standing. In exchange, the compact establishes binding recognition of all current member species' territorial sovereignty, with equal political standing for all signatories regardless of fleet size, on a technological level, or age of Concord membership." She looked around the room. "This is not a threat, it is an offer. We are not asking for dominance. We are asking for the equality we were promised when we joined this organization 80 years ago, and which has, in practice, been denied us by the weight of assumption and the comfort of those who were never in our position." She picked up her notes and walked back to her seat. The chamber did not explode this time. It was very, very quiet for a long moment. Then the voting terminals began to light up, one by one, then in groups, then all at once. The Mutual Defense Compact passed by the widest margin in Concord history. It took 47 minutes. In the corridors outside the assembly chamber, things were less calm, and the Jaqueth diplomatic delegation moved through the building in a tight cluster, surrounded by the particular silence that fell around people who had just suffered a very public humiliation in front of the entire known galaxy. Nobody was openly hostile to them. Galactic diplomatic culture had centuries of practice at the art of being politely restrained about the misfortunes of others. But the space around the Imperial delegation felt different than it had a week ago. Less deference, less careful maneuvering to avoid giving offense to a power that everyone feared. Val Koss, who had delivered the ultimatum in this same building 37 days ago, with the confident ease of someone announcing an inevitable outcome, walked through those corridors and felt every moment of the difference. He sent his daily report to the Imperial capital as he always did. It was the most difficult report he had ever written. He was a careful man, an experienced diplomat. He knew how to frame bad news in language that was accurate without being incendiary. But there was only so much that careful language could do with facts of this particular kind, and the facts were these. The operation had failed. The Third Armada had engaged the human fleet and withdrawn. The engagement had lasted less than 2 hours. The political landscape of the Concord had shifted in humanity's favor in ways that would take years, possibly decades, to fully reverse. He sent the report. He sat in his office and looked at the wall for a while. Then he began drafting a second communication, separate from the formal report channel. This one went directly to the Imperial Strategy Council. It was short. It said in the careful language of a diplomat who understood that some things needed to be said plainly. The intelligence assessment was wrong. The scope of the error needs to be understood clearly before any further action is considered. He sent that one too. Then he poured himself another drink and did not feel good about it this time. 1,200 light years away, in the great hall of the Jaqueth Imperial Palace, Emperor Javel III sat at the head of a table surrounded by people who did not want to be the one to look directly at him. The hall was enormous and ancient. Its walls were lined with the banners of every territory the Empire had absorbed in 300 years of expansion. There were a great many banners. Yes, the Empire had been absorbing territories for a long time, and it had been very good at it, and the hall reflected this. It was designed to remind everyone who entered it that the Jaqueth Empire was old and powerful and had been winning for a very long time. The people around the table were some of the most senior figures in that empire. Fleet admirals, intelligence chiefs, members of the Strategy Council. They had military careers between them that totaled over 400 years of service. They had collectively overseen more military operations than could be easily counted. None of them were looking at the Emperor directly. Fleet Admiral Varketh was there, having returned from the Kepler Quarter with what remained of the Third Armada. When he looked like a man who had put in a great deal of effort to appear the same as he had always appeared, and was not entirely succeeding. Intelligence Commander Shrathvon was also there. He was not making any effort to appear the same as he had always appeared. There was no point. Everyone in the room had read his assessment. Everyone in the room knew how comprehensively that assessment had been wrong. The Emperor was not shouting. He was not throwing things. He was not doing any of the dramatic things that stories about powerful rulers in moments of crisis tended to include. He was sitting very still, looking at the data reports spread on the table in front of him, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. "How many ship?" he said. The senior analyst, a young woman named Pretha who had drawn the short straw in terms of who had to deliver the numbers, looked at her report. "Current best estimate, Your Majesty, is 14,000 confirmed active warships, reserve fleet in mothball status, an additional estimated 6,000. Ships currently under construction at facilities we have now identified." She paused because this part was genuinely difficult to say. "Classified. We cannot determine the number because we cannot determine how many construction facilities exist." The Emperor looked at her. "You cannot determine how many construction facilities exist." "No, Your Majesty. The facilities that were revealed during the engagement represent significantly more infrastructure than any of our prior surveys suggested. If we are working on revised estimates, but the scope of what we missed is—" She stopped. She chose her next word carefully. "Substantial." The room was quiet. The Emperor looked at the banner nearest to him. It was from the Kaloran Confederation, absorbed 112 years ago. The Kaloran had been a mid-level power with a reasonable military and a strong economy, and absolutely no idea that the Empire was coming for them until the fleet appeared in their system. He wondered briefly what they had felt in that moment. He thought he might now have some small sense of it. "Shrathvon," the Emperor said. The intelligence commander straightened. "Your Majesty, your assessment stated 600 combat-capable vessels." "Yes, Your Majesty. The actual number is 14,000. Shrathvon did not flinch. He was, at his core, still a professional, and professionals did not flinch. But something in his expression was different from what it usually was. "Yes, Your Majesty, that is correct." The Emperor was quiet for a moment. "How?" "The construction was conducted in concealed facilities across a large number of star systems. The facilities were hidden in locations that our survey probes did not flag as significant. The ships themselves were designed to avoid standard recognition protocols. The human government maintained a visible fleet that matched our expectations precisely, while the concealed fleet was built and maintained separately, with complete operational secrecy maintained over—" He paused. "Over approximately 60 years. 60 years. Yes, Your Majesty. 60 years. The Emperor looked at the table. 60 years of building in the dark. 60 years of letting everyone look at the thing you wanted them to see while you kept the real thing hidden. 60 years of patience. He thought about all the assessments, all the reports, all the presentations he had received over the years from various intelligence divisions about the various minor civilizations in the Concord's outer membership. He thought about how often those reports had used the word lesser fleet capacity, lesser technological development, lesser strategic significance. He thought about how comfortable it was to receive those reports, because they confirmed the shape of the universe as the Empire understood it. He thought about 60 years. "Send a diplomatic envoy to humanity," he said. The table was very quiet. His military advisor leaned forward slightly. "Your Majesty, if the purpose is to request a ceasefire, our position in the negotiation—" "Not to negotiate," the Emperor said, "to apologize." The table became quieter still. "We attacked them. We told them in front of the entire Concord that their space was ours to take. We sent 4,000 ships to prove it. We were wrong." He looked around the table. Nobody spoke. "Send an envoy, a real one. Not a political officer, not an intelligence analyst, not someone whose primary skill is extracting favorable terms. Send someone who can look another person in the eye and deliver a genuine apology without a condition attached to it. He stood. The meeting was ending. And find out, he said, how many construction facilities there are. All of them. I don't ever want to be surprised like this again. He walked out of the hall. The banner of the Kaloran Confederation watched him go. A young Jaketh diplomat named Kael'thas received his assignment the following morning. He was 29 years old. He had been in the diplomatic corps for 4 years. He had never been given an assignment remotely like this one. He read the briefing 3 times. He packed his bag. He boarded a shuttle. The shuttle was small and unescorted, and it flew without military markings. It was, in every visible way, a civilian vessel. This was intentional. There was no point in sending a military escort when the entire galaxy now knew, with complete certainty, that a military escort would not help. Kael'thas sat in his seat as the shuttle crossed into human space and looked out the window at the stars. He was not a brave person in any dramatic sense. He was a careful, intelligent, a relatively junior diplomat who was very good at his job and who found himself, through circumstances that were entirely outside his control, carrying the formal apology of the most powerful empire in the known galaxy to the people they had just tried to rob. He thought about the battle footage. He had watched it 6 times. He kept coming back to the moment when the human fleet had decloaked. All of it, all at once, filling the sensor display from every direction. He kept trying to imagine what it had felt like to be on the bridge of the Imperial flagship and watch that happen. He thought about 60 years. He thought about what kind of people built that kind of secret and kept it that perfectly, for that long, for that reason. He looked out at human space and found himself strangely not afraid, just very, very curious. Now the shuttle moved through the dark, alone and small, toward whatever came next. The shuttle docked with the UES Rubicon at 0600 hours, ship time. Kael'thas had been told in the briefing he had read 3 times before leaving the Imperial capital that the Rubicon was one of humanity's lighter vessels, a command ship primarily, not one of the enormous warships that had materialized from the dark during the engagement. By the standards of the fleet he had seen in the battle footage, it was modest, a relay point, a flagship in the administrative sense rather than the purely military one. It was still the largest vessel Kael'thas had ever been aboard. He stood in the docking bay and tried not to show how strongly this registered. He was a diplomat. Showing how things registered was not always useful. But the scale of even this ship, the weight of the construction, the thickness of the hull plating visible where the docking passage connected, communicated something that could not be easily articulated and that no written briefing had prepared him for. There was a difference between knowing intellectually that humanity had built 14,000 warships and standing inside one of them. Admiral Morrow was waiting for him at the end of the docking passage. He was not what Kael'thas had expected. The battle footage showed him at a distance, sitting in a command chair, in the brief moments between the fleet's revelation and the engagement beginning. In person, he was broader, more ordinary-looking, wearing a gray uniform with minimal insignia. And he had the kind of face that had spent a great deal of time in low-light environments, the particular pallor of deep space service. He shook Kael'thas's hand with the firm, straightforward grip that humans apparently used as a standard greeting. "Kael'thas," Morrow said. "I'm James Morrow. Welcome aboard." "Thank you, Admiral. I bring formal apologies from His Majesty Emperor Javel III and—" "Walk with me," Morrow said, not dismissively, simply in the way of a person who preferred to talk while moving. They walked. The corridors of the Rubicon were wide enough to move large equipment through, the ceilings higher than was strictly necessary for a crew of human height. The walls lined with the kind of industrial practicality that said this ship had been built to work rather than to impress. Kael'thas noticed crew members going about their duties. Some glanced at him with the frank curiosity that humans were not always great at hiding. None of them were hostile. Morrow led him through several corridors and a lift, and eventually out into a large observation room near the forward section of the ship. One entire wall was transparent, a direct view of space. The fleet was out there, holding position in the corridor, spread across a huge area of space, the ships visible as points of light in the dark with a particular quality of lights that were very large and very far away and still bright. Morrow stopped at the transparent wall. He looked out at the fleet. He seemed for a moment to simply be looking at it, not performing or posturing, just looking. Kaltas stood beside him. He looked out at the same view. He was quiet for a moment because the view demanded a moment of quiet. Then he said, "How?" It was not the formally prepared question. The formally prepared questions were in his briefing, but it was the question that had been sitting at the back of everything since he had first watched the battle footage, and it came out before the formal questions could get in front of it. Morrow glanced at him sideways. A slight, brief expression crossed his face that was not quite a smile, but was in that direction. "How did we build it without anyone knowing?" Morrow said. "Yes, and why? How did you maintain the secrecy? How did an entire civilization agree to keep a secret this large for 60 years? These are not things that species do," Kaltas said. "Coalition governments disagree. Contractors talk. Intelligence services find things. Wes, these are understood realities of galactic civilization. You should not have been able to do this. The fact that you did is—" He stopped. He tried to find the right word. "Unusual," Morrow offered. "I was going to say terrifying," Kaltas said, and then looked briefly alarmed at himself for saying it. Morrow actually smiled at that, a small, genuine one. "It's an honest answer. I respect that." He looked back out at the fleet. "We had a reason," he said. "One big, clear reason that every single person involved understood. 60 years ago, we lost 60,000 people because we were too small and too unprepared, and the people who were supposed to help us arrived too late. Those people left families behind, children who grew up knowing how their parents died. And those children grew up, and some of them went into politics, and some went into engineering, and some went into the military, and every single one of them carried the same reason with them." He paused. "It is very easy to keep a secret when the secret is, never again." Kaltas looked at the fleet. 14,000 ships in the dark. 60 years of grief made into metal and fire. "The intelligence assessments," he said carefully, "consistently classified humanity as a lesser-tier civilization." "Yes," Morrow said, "you knew this. We made sure of it. We showed every survey exactly what we wanted them to see. We kept the registered fleet at exactly the numbers that fit the assessment. We designed the Prometheus vessels to avoid the recognition protocols that your analysts and everyone else's analysts were using. And we knew how the assessments worked because we understood how the analysts thought and how they thought was. These are lesser beings. They have a small fleet. We have confirmed the small fleet. Assessment complete." He turned slightly to look at Kaltas directly. "Your people didn't miss something hidden in complicated data. They missed something hidden in plain sight, behind a belief they never questioned. They knew we had 600 ships. They had confirmed it many times. It was in all the reports. It never occurred to them to ask if the thing they kept confirming might be exactly what we wanted them to keep confirming." Kaltas was quiet for a moment, thinking about this. "You could have revealed the fleet at any point," he said. "Years ago. Decades ago. The presence of this fleet alone would have changed your political standing in the Concord dramatically. You would have been treated as a major power. You would have had more influence, more protection, better treaties." "Yes," Morrow said simply, "but you didn't." "No. Why?" Morrow looked back out at the ships. "Because the moment you show it, it changes what it is," he said. "As long as it was hidden, it was a secret, a surprise, a card you hadn't played yet. The moment you put it on the table in peacetime, it becomes a political tool, and political tools get negotiated and compromised and traded away by people who don't understand what they are." He shook his head slightly. "We weren't building a political tool. We were building a guarantee. There's a difference." He looked at the UES Titan, out visible near the center of the fleet formation, its running lights burning steadily in the dark. It was the ship Shrath Vaughn's probe had photographed for 11 seconds before being removed. The ship whose image had been filed as a sensor artifact. "We were building the thing that meant no one would ever send 60,000 people's children to die without help coming in time," Morrow said. "That was what it was for. It was never about showing it. It was about having it." Kaltas looked at the fleet for a long moment. He thought about the Emperor in the Great Hall, surrounded by the banners of conquered civilizations, asking in a quiet voice how 60,000 deaths had built something like this. He thought about Strathvon and the certainty in the report and the tiny, filed-away image of a ship in the dark. "Is there anything," he said, choosing the words carefully, "that the Empire can do to make this right? Not the formal apology. I understand that has limited weight given the circumstances. But genuinely, is there something—" "Leave us alone," Morrow said. It was said simply, not with anger or bitterness, just with the plain weight of something that had always been true. That is all we have ever wanted, from the Empire, from the Concord, from every civilization that looked at us and decided we were lesser and acted accordingly. Leave us alone. Let us trade in peace. Let us move through our space without being told what it is or isn't ours to keep." He paused. "We are not an aggressive people, Kael'thas. We did not build this fleet to go out and take things. We built it so that no one could take things from us. There is a difference between those two purposes, and I would very much like the galaxy to understand it." Kael'thas nodded slowly. "I will communicate this accurately." "I know you will," Morrow said. "That's why they sent you." The formal session between the Imperial envoy and the human diplomatic mission took place 2 days later aboard a Concord neutral station, conducted with the careful procedural dignity that galactic diplomacy required. The Emperor's apology was delivered. Elena Vasquez received it on behalf of humanity with the same measured grace she had shown throughout all 30 days, and the battle and everything that followed. Afterward, she sat in her office on the station and wrote a long letter to her youngest daughter, who was 12 years old and had asked in a message 3 weeks ago whether everything was going to be okay. She wrote that it was. She meant it. And the galaxy did not stand still in the months that followed. The Mutual Defense Compact was ratified by 39 of the 47 Concord member species within the first 6 weeks. The remaining 8 signed within the year, some because they believed in the principle, some because the political landscape had shifted clearly enough that not signing was a stranger choice than signing, and a few because a quiet conversation with a human diplomatic representative had clarified in polite and helpful language that the compact's benefits were available to its signatories and its protections would be extended accordingly. 3 other aggressive powers that had been involved in long-standing territorial disputes with Concord member species suddenly, and with very little public explanation, withdrew their disputed claims. No ships were fired. No confrontation occurred. These powers simply, quietly, stopped pressing the claims they had been pressing for years. The reason, generally understood even if never officially stated, was that each of these powers had received a standard communication from the Terran Concord mission. The communication contained as an attachment a detailed operational summary of the Kepler Corridor engagement. It contained the fleet deployment numbers, it contained the performance data on the Prometheus vessels, and it contained at the bottom a single paragraph noting that humanity took its obligations under the Mutual Defense Compact seriously and would regard any threat to a compact member's sovereignty as a matter requiring a response. The disputes were dropped. No further communication was necessary. In a classified archive of the Jacqueth Imperial Military Academy, added to the required reading list for every officer candidate 6 months after the Kepler Corridor engagement, there was a document. It was not long. It was drawn from the post-operation review that Strathvon had been required to write. A systematic and honest account of every point at which the intelligence assessment had gone wrong, written by a man who had spent his career being thorough and who now spent his days being thorough about his own failure. The document was used not as a punishment for Strathvon, but as a lesson for everyone who came after him. A case study in a very specific kind of mistake. The mistake of letting what you expect to find determine what you look for, and letting what you find confirm what you already believed. At the top of the document, either added by whoever had prepared it for teaching purposes, was a short paragraph. It was not written in Strathvon's voice. It read, "Before this engagement, the intelligence position on human military capability was widely considered to be the most thoroughly confirmed assessment in our files. It had been verified by multiple independent surveys. It was consistent with every observable data point. There was no significant dissenting analysis. It was wrong by a factor of approximately 23. There is a lesson here that applies beyond intelligence work. It applies to any situation in which a powerful party looks at a less powerful party and arrives at a settled conclusion about what they are and what they are not capable of. The settled conclusion is comfortable. It is reinforced by repetition. It is almost never examined once it is established. Humanity was quiet for 80 years. They built their fleet in the dark. They watched us watch them, and they gave us exactly what we expected to see. And when we arrived at their door with 4,000 ships, confident in our assessment, we discovered that our confidence had been the most useful tool they had. Do not mistake patience for weakness. Do not mistake silence for absence. Do not look at a species and decide based on what you can see that you understand what they have. The last line of the document was not from Schrathvahn's review. It had been added later, and its source was never officially attributed, though several people in the Imperial Diplomatic Corps privately knew it had come from the notes that Kael'thas wrote on the shuttle ride back from his meeting with Admiral Morrow. They said humans didn't have ships like that. They were wrong. They will not be wrong again. But more importantly, they will not need to be. Because now the galaxy knows, and knowing is enough. In the observation room of the UES Rubicon, the fleet still held its position in the Kepler corridor. It would hold there for another 3 weeks, visible and steady, before the order came to stand down and return to station. There was no military reason to keep it deployed that long. Everyone who needed to understand the situation understood it, but Admiral Morrow had asked for the 3 weeks, and he had been given them. When on most evenings of those 3 weeks he came to the observation room and stood at the transparent wall and looked out at the ships. He thought about the crew of the UES Forward, about 60,000 people, about the children who had grown up and picked up the work. He thought about Sergeant Torres in the dark facility under KAB-7M3, watching the lights come on for the first time in a decade. He thought about all the engineers and technicians and crew members and officers who had spent pieces of their lives building something in secret and trusting that the secret would hold. It had held. The ships were there, steady in the dark, burning bright on every sensor display in the known galaxy. No longer a secret, no longer a hidden card. Something different now, a declaration, written in metal and fire, sewn in a language that every civilization in known space could read without a translator. We are here. We have always been here. We are not what you thought we were. We are not what you thought we were at all. Morrow looked at the fleet for a long time. Then he went to bed because there was work in the morning, and the galaxy, for the first time in a long time, was not a place where humanity needed to be afraid.